This encounter takes place in northeast Montana in 2015. I live in rural Montana near the Fort Peck Indian Reservation just outside the town of Baylor. One of the many things I like about my house is that there are no neighbors around for many miles. There was a time when we were close to another house, but it burned down not long after it was built, and only the remnants of the foundation remains now. Next to our property is an empty field about the size of a football field with an old barbed wire fence separating it from my yard. The other side of that just goes up into more rough land, an area I don't get to very much. A few years ago, I think around 2015, I was out in my shed workshop late at night when I heard a dog barking. It was the kind of dog that was very vocal. Not the quiet kind of dog making noises now and then. But the strange thing about this was that there were no dogs around here, so this was totally out of place. While I listened to the dog bark, it also seemed to be getting closer and closer. So I walked outside my shop with a flashlight and saw it running up the road from where I was standing. So I decided to walk over and see what was going on. Maybe it was hurt, or what it was all about. I caught up to it to find it barking at the gate to the field that goes up into the rough land above the property. And that's when I could clearly see that this was the strangest dog that I'd ever seen in my life. It was standing on its hind legs and putting its front paws onto the gate to get higher up and barking like crazy. The dog features stood out pretty clearly in the moonlight, and it had fierce dog-like teeth and fairly long hair over most of its body. And I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it was dog-like, but in a strange way because it moved and stood like a human. Its arms and legs were dog-like too, not human-shaped. It also seemed agitated and maybe even scared of me, so I tried to walk past it into the field, but I could tell right away that it was afraid of me being there. I raised my hands to show that I didn't have any weapons, but then it jumped into the field and ran off on its two back legs, just like a human would run. It loped over a hill and was gone in only a few strides. I stood there for a while, looking at the spot where it disappeared, wondering if maybe I was mistaken somehow, or if my mind had played a trick on me. So I went back home, and I sat there wondering if I was just imagining things. I mean, it's not the kind of dog you see every day for sure, and no matter where you are, dogs that have human-like characteristics are certainly not common. But it was all very real to me that day. And then about 2 days after this incident, I went back into the field looking for any dog droppings or anything like that, but nothing. So next I walked over towards the rough area past the field where it had run off to, and I looked around in that area. Well, don't you know that I found droppings right there? Not to get too gross, but it looked like a human had just done their business right there in the great outdoors. And this left me with more questions than answers, so I continued walking and looking around. There was evidence of dog prints where a dog had obviously walked around and broken the grasses and weeds where it looked like it might have sat down here and there. But the dog prints weren't dog-like in the slightest. They were like dog mixed with human prints. And also this area was pretty sandy, and you could tell that the creature who made the prints didn't have a natural dog's padding on its paws, but almost like a human's bare foot. This dog-like print mixed with a human outline was the most confusing thing about it. I could see that this dog had walked upright on two legs all the time, not just when running. And so I decided to continue my search, and it wasn't before long that I heard screaming and thrashing in the trees like something was running and trying to get away. And just as I was able to focus on the area where the noise was coming from, another, or maybe it was the same, dog creature came busting out of the bushes and ran up an embankment. It was so quick that I didn't get a very good look at it, but I could tell that it was dog-like, just like the dog I had heard barking and that I saw the other day. And then, running behind it and chasing it, came a dog that was barking and jumping after it. I could see that this dog was chasing the dog creature, and as soon as the dog caught up to it, they both vanished into some more dense brush. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what had just happened, so I took my handgun with me and went up over the embankment to the place where these dog creatures had gone. I walked around the area looking for any footprints or signs where they had possibly gone to. And before long I came across the dog that had been chasing the dogman. The dog was sniffing around and actually looked at me and started wagging his tail when I walked up to him. "Good boy," I said, so he could hear my voice and know I wasn't a threat. But where in the world had this dog come from? This dog had chased a dogman into that thick brush, and now the dogman was gone. I stood there for a while thinking about it, but then decided to go back home and bring the dog with me. I mean, who knows where he came from, but he certainly couldn't live out here all alone. So I had him follow me back to my house, where I fed him and cleaned him up and took care of him. We tried for months to find his owner, but nothing ever materialized. It's like he just showed up out of thin air. And now I wonder how he ended up in these woods and got involved with the dogman in the first place. Were there more than one of those creatures out there? And why was this dog chasing it in the first place? Meanwhile, I have 3 dogs of my own, and they're all very sweet dogs and great family pets, but this dog that chased the dogman is not like any dog I've ever had before. He looks at me with these eyes that seem to totally understand my words, and he runs faster than any dog I've ever had. Just some things to think about. It's almost as if there's something special going on with him, and I wonder if anybody else has seen anything like him before. I mean, I'm honestly wondering if he's some kind of a hybrid. Like, could he have some small part of dogman in him? No dog I've ever encountered runs faster or is more intelligent than he is, and he seems to have some extra intense dog behaviors, like a super strong prey response, and he isn't bothered by strong weather like thunderstorms and blizzards. Anyway, he's like my own dogs now, as in he's totally a part of the family, but still different somehow. I guess I'll never know how he got to this part of Montana and what he was doing chasing the dogman. Oh yeah, and I forgot to say that roughly once a year he runs away and is gone for a few days, but he always comes back eventually. I truly think he's meeting up with those dog creatures that roam these parts. What do you think? This encounter takes place in Lowell, Oregon in March of 2016. I was on my way to visit a friend of mine in Oak Ridge, Oregon. I was driving up from Eugene, which was supposed to take about 45 minutes, but right around Lowell there was an accident on the highway, and all the traffic was rerouted off onto a smaller, more rural road. It was starting to get dark, but not really too late yet when I decided to pull over at a gas station on this rural road. It was freezing cold, but I really needed gas, and there were very few stations on this road anyway. I got out and started pumping gas, thinking about how I was wishing I didn't have to drive the rest of this trip on this road that I didn't know. It was also dark back here, and I didn't like how uncomfortable it made me feel. And right as I was having those thoughts, that's when I first heard it. I first heard this dog-like growl, sort of a low rumbling sound. I looked up and my jaw dropped open when I saw 2 dog-like creatures coming out from the trees that lined the gas station. I say dog-like because that's what they were, but what confused me was that they were much bigger than any dog I had ever seen. They were both covered in grayish-brown hair and walked out on their hind legs, looking sort of natural. I mean, there was something dog-like about them, and yet at the same time they looked nothing like any dog I had ever seen. The thing I remember the most is their size. These 2 dog-like creatures were incredibly massive, as if a dog had somehow mutated into something larger and more intimidating. I think that's what really got me at first, was the size. They both came out of the woods looking right at me, almost like they had been waiting for me. And there was this dog-like growling sound coming from them. And it was only then that I realized I was actually the thing they were growling at. I felt like they were challenging me, almost like a dog would do when it's scaring something away that's walked into its territory. I stood there in disbelief, not knowing what to do. I mean, there's no way these dog-like creatures could be real. They had to be a joke or something, right? But the more they started walking towards me, this low, guttural growl coming from them, I found myself becoming more and more afraid. The dog-like creatures came up to me and sort of circled around me, sniffing at my legs and my hands, darting in and out at me so fast that I could hardly follow them. It was starting to get even darker now, and I remember a complete feeling of dread run down my spine as I realized I had no idea how I was going to get away from these things. And by the way, dogs definitely do not have a mouth like these things did. It was just completely black, like there was nothing inside. I know that doesn't make sense, but it's the only way I can describe what they looked like. But they did have these long, sharp teeth that I could see when they would take a deep breath in before making their crazy howling noises. The dog-like creatures continued circling me. I remember the howls becoming louder and more threatening as they circled. And every now and then they'd come up closer, sniffing my back before circling around in front again. Finally, one of them came up on the side of me while the other positioned itself behind me, and I could feel the massive hot breath on my neck and back as they continued to sniff me like I was prey. I remember looking down at the ground, trying not to make eye contact, and seeing these huge paws that I realized must be hands for these dog-like creatures. They looked almost like giant bear paws, but with claws instead of regular dog nails. And that's when I heard the scariest sound I've ever heard. Sort of like a deep human growl, but at the same time, nothing like anything I've ever heard before. I looked up and saw one of the dog-like creatures staring directly into my eyes with his mouth wide open, just this black abyss staring back at me. And that's when I began to scream. I could feel myself being pulled backwards away from the dog-like creature that was staring at me, and then I could see the other one lunging towards me. The last thing I remember of it all is seeing this giant bear-like paw coming at me and then a loud bang as I fell to the ground. I don't know how long I was out, but I eventually woke up, panicked, my whole body shaking as I tried to process what had even just happened. But the creatures were gone, and the gas station was now dark. At first I thought maybe it had all been a dream or something, but standing over me was the attendant who had just closed up the station and was heading to his car to leave for the night. He was leaning over me asking if I was all right and said that I might want to go to the hospital to get checked out. I was laying on the ground when he came out, and he wondered if maybe I had fainted or something. I told him thanks and that I would, even though I knew that I wouldn't. I mean, how do you explain being attacked by a dogman to a doctor or a hospital emergency room? I knew that all that would do would get me a fast-track trip to the psych ward. Anyway, I remember finally getting up and into my car and just sitting there trying to rationalize it all, wondering if maybe it had been a prank by some complete idiot teenagers who didn't realize how traumatizing it was. But it did happen. I got back in my car and decided that instead of driving back home, which was a longer ride, I'd just continue on to my friend's house, even though I'd have to continue on this back road. Anyway, I was also looking forward to being with someone and not just being alone. This last part of the ride was intense. I could barely think, and I couldn't help but constantly look in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those creatures following me somehow. Shadows popped out along the side of the road, and I swear I saw the two dog-like creatures hiding behind trees and bushes all along the way. It took me everything to not stop the car and run, but I knew that was crazy and would just make me more vulnerable, and so instead I just kept driving. The scary part is that even when I did get back to my friend's house, it never really hit me how intense it all was until I started telling him about it. As I sat there telling him what had happened, it suddenly became even more terrifying and overwhelming. I was shaking uncontrollably by the time I finished telling my story. He obviously believed me because of the way I was acting, and he was really concerned. He also said that I should get checked out at the hospital, but I said, no way. I knew that I wouldn't be able to drive myself back home even if the highway was open and I didn't need to go on those back roads. And just the thought of being in the car was totally freaking me out. Luckily, he insisted on driving me back home, and we ended up telling my local police when we got there. They didn't really believe us, thinking that we may have been on drugs or something, but they did take down our statements and said they'd refer it to the county sheriff for investigation. The scary thing is that I know that those creatures are still out there, lurking somewhere in the forest. And if I saw 2 of them, then surely there must be more. And no matter how hard I try to forget about it, I know I'll never be able to. Honestly, I think that's the scary part. Knowing that they're still out there somewhere and not being able to do anything about it. Basically, at this point, it's only me and my friend who believes what happened to me. And he didn't have to experience it, which means I have to deal with that part of it alone. But that's why I'm writing to you here. I'm hoping to find other people who have experienced something like this. I just don't want to feel alone anymore.